Zimbabwe's foreign minister spoke at the African Union was gathering, he wasn't just making a statement, he was actually laying out a series of key positions that reflect broader continental trends.
African narrative can only come from Africans. So that's the first most important thing. And sovereignty is our policy-making space. Therefore, Africa as policy-making space is to be respected. That's the pure definition of sovereignty. It means we make our decisions within our borders, which is the African borders. So Africa is African, with Africans making their decisions. Other people can think whatever they want to think about, but Africa thinks about itself. And that's the narrative. When the United Nations was formed in 1945, all of Africa was a colony of some colonial power, and therefore it does not reflect the United Nations as we speak today does not reflect that reality. Therefore, as a good organization, member state driven, it should always be reformed in order to reflect the reality on the ground.
First, he stressed that Africa's cultural heritage belongs to Africans. This connects to long-standing calls for African states for the return of cultural artifacts taken during colonial times, ladies and gentlemen. For years, countries or states across West, East, Central, and of course Southern Africa have asked museums, and government in Europe and of course North America to return items of deep cultural and historical importance. The minister said that respecting the African Union's resolutions on this matter is essential, not optional. That shows unity among African states over cultural dignity, ladies and gentlemen. Second, the minister addressed the sanctions imposed by external powers without approval from the United Nations. He stated clearly that Zimbabwe abides by international law and believes any sanctions must be authorized by the UN's global body. This remark was actually directed at sanctions placed primarily by the United States of America and other Western states or countries, which Zimbabwe says hurt its economy and of course people. Many African leaders, ladies and gentlemen, feel the same way. That punitive measures without global legal backing undermine international fairness. Third, he spoke about joining BRICS, a group of major emerging economies that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and of course South Africa. Zimbabwe has applied to become a member. A foreign minister explained that this step actually aligns with his country's belief in multilateral, meaning working with many nations or countries together to solve problems. He said BRICS represent peace and progress, showing how nations in Africa are exploring alternative partnerships to traditional relationships with Western powers like the US or America. Fourth, the minister took aim at how the United Nations currently functions. He pointed out that the UN doesn't reflect the modern world, especially Africa's place within it. Africa has the largest share of the world's population under the age of 25, yet it holds no permanent seat on the UN Security Council. That council has the power to sanction nations, including Zimbabwe, which brings the argument full cycle. Through these steps, the foreign minister outlines a vision of sovereignty where Africans control their own narratives, resources, heritage, and of course diplomatic futures. These are not just political statements, ladies and gentlemen. They are signposts of how Africa is thinking about its place in the global order. The comments by Zimbabwe's foreign minister at the African Union Forum are not isolated. They reflect broader themes shaping Africa's diplomatic landscape. Across the continent, nations or countries are talking more about sovereignty or independence. The idea that Africa controls its own political choices and of course economic path. For many decades, African nations or countries worked with identity systems established by former colonial powers and shaped by global institutions dominated by Europe and Northwestern America. Today, more African leaders say that must be changed. Sanctions, for example, are not just about one country or state. States such as Zimbabwe, Angola, and other in Southern Africa have faced restrictions imposed by Western governments, mainly the United States of America. Those measures are often justified by accusations of governance problems or human rights issues. However, many African governments say that when sanctions are applied without approval from the United Nations Security Council, it undermines the rule of law at the global level. The foreign ministers called to respect the African Union's decisions ties into a long history of Pan-African African cooperation. The African Union was actually founded to replace the Organization of African Unity, a group that once focused mainly on ending colonial rule. Today's African Union deals with peacekeeping, economic development, cultural cooperation, and of course continental integration. By insisting that African narrative can only come from Africans, quotation close, the Zimbabwe leader echoed a view held by diplomats throughout Africa that shared history must guard shared futures. The call for return of stolen cultural artifacts also has wide implications. Countries or states in West Africa, such as Nigeria and Ghana, have spearheaded efforts to reclaim treasures taken during colonial conquest. Likewise, nations in East Africa like Ethiopia and Kenya have made public appeals. These efforts are supported by communities, scholars, and of course heritage activists who say that returning those objects restores dignity and corrects historical wrongs. On the multilateral front, Zimbabwe's expressed interest in joining BRICS points toward Africa's search for new diplomatic and economic partnerships. BRICS currently includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, a mix of nations representing large populations and growing markets. For African states or countries, BRICS offers an alternative platform for cooperation beyond traditional Western institutions. By focusing on these themes, sovereignty, heritage, law, and of course multilateralism, the minister's comments highlight how African states or countries are rethinking their roles in world affairs. These are not abstract ideas. They are anchored in history, shaped by shared experiences of colonization and aimed at building a future designed by African priorities. As we wrap up, it is important to look at what is officially confirmed so far based on public statements and diplomatic activity. There has been no sudden conflict or violent escalation tied to these remarks or statements. Instead, what we see is a series of diplomatic positions gaining visibility. First, Zimbabwe's appeal for respect of African Union's decisions, especially on cultural heritage, has been backed by several other African states or countries. Countries such as Senegal, Nigeria, and Ethiopia have long raised the same concerns at regional and global forums. Their unified stance gives weight to the call for return of African artifacts held in museums from the continent. Second, the assertion that sanctions without UN approval are illegal reflects a long-standing legal debate. The United Nations Charter gives the Security Council exclusive authority to impose sanctions that bind all member states. When other governments impose unilateral measures, many African diplomats argue that those actions are inconsistent with international law. This view was actually articulated clearly by Zimbabwe's foreign minister and of course echoed by other African representatives at the same meeting. Third, on the issue of reforming the United Nations, African states continue to advocate for greater representation. Africa currently holds no permanent seat on the Security Council, even though it is home to more than 1/6 of the world's population. This imbalance is widely recognized as a structural issue that many African governments want corrected. Fourth, Zimbabwe's interest in joining BRICS remains active whilst the application process takes time and of course must be approved by existing members or states. What does all this teach us? It shows that Africa's diplomatic agenda is becoming more assertive. Countries or states are pushing ideas based on unity, legal principles, and of course respect for history. Thank you so much for watching this video. See you next.